The first truck came up the gravel lane a little after dawn on a warm morning in the spring of 2015, its bed already tilting as it swung wide at the top of the yard. It did not stop at the house. The hydraulics whined over the idling diesel, the tailgate banged open, and a load of spent brewing grain slid off in a soft, heavy rush. Tons of warm, wet, dark gold mash tumbling over itself and settling in a sweet, sour, malty heap across the gravel. The driver never got down from the cab. Before the mist had lifted, a second truck came, and behind it a third, and the smell of warm bread and vinegar hung over the whole hollow. By mid-morning, 3 steaming mounds of spent grain stood at the edge of the lot, higher than a man, on a farm the county had long since given up on. Cars slowed on the valley road to look at the dark heaps, giving off their faint, sweet steam in the low sun, and the people in them saw exactly what they expected. One more indignity piled on a piece of ground everyone agreed was finished. It was the leavings of Alder Creek Brewing, the big craft brewery and taproom over on the county line. The spent grain, the soaked and swollen malt the mash tun leaves behind once the sweet wort is drawn off for beer. Only the wort goes forward, the grain is spent, drained of its sugar, and in a county filling up with breweries there were tons of it every week. For years it had gone free to a hog farmer down the valley who fed it wet to his stock, until he sold his herd and quit, and the mash had nowhere to go. The brewery had once shaken hands with the old man who farmed this place, tipped the spent grain on his back lot for free, save everyone the hauling, and no one had thought to cancel it. Now the brewery had grown, the feed farmer was gone, and the landfill charged by the ton for something 4/5 water that soured in a day. So the old free lot was the cheapest place left. But the old man's granddaughter stood at the edge of the gravel with a mug of coffee going cold in her hand. And the question behind her eyes was not the one the drivers would have guessed. If the only thing wrong with this grain was that it was in the brewery's way, why was the brewery paying good money to make it disappear? Her name was Della Rourke, and she was 53 that spring. The farm was 70-odd acres of hill and bottomland in the driftless country of southwestern Wisconsin, her grandfather's ground, where she had spent the summers of her youth among his oats and his rye before a working life carried her away. For nearly 30 years she had been a grain lab technician at a country flour mill, measuring moisture and protein, reading falling number and grade, deciding whether a load of wheat was sound or would spoil, until the mill was bought out, consolidated, and closed, and her job went with it. The farm her grandfather had signed over to her years before was the one place she had left to go. She came home to a sagging barn roof, a grain drill seized to rust, a backfield gone to volunteer ride the appraiser called a weed patch, 2 seasons of back taxes, and the gentle, unanimous advice of nearly everyone she met: sell it and be done. Quick pause right here near the start. If stories like this one keep finding their way to you, this channel is probably worth sticking around for. Go ahead and subscribe. And do one small thing for me while you're here. Tell me where you're watching from tonight down in the comments. I read every single one. Now back to the story. The advice was kind, and it was not exactly wrong. The man from the county who valued the place that spring said out loud what everyone already believed: the ground was steep, the barn was going, and nobody made 70 hill acres pay anymore. The volunteer rye in the back field, he said, was the poorest part of it, a stand of weedy old grain not worth the cutting. The bank said the same in colder words. Written off, that was the phrase living underneath all of it, the one nobody said to her face. The land was written off, and so, she understood plainly enough, was the 53-year-old woman standing on it, with no job, no marriage any longer, and no notion of how to run a farm. She had been home the better part of a year when the trucks came, and she had spent those months quietly deciding whether the whole county was right about her. The morning after the third truck, before the sun had cleared the ridge, Della walked out to the mounds with a spiral notebook, a folding scoop, and the same little moisture meter she had carried in a coat pocket for 20 years. She did not call the brewery, and she did not call a lawyer. She took a handful of the warm spent grain and read it the way the lab had taught her, rubbing it for the swollen, sweet-smelling malt under the sour top layer, pressing a sample to feel how much water it still held. This was not garbage. It was grain, soaked and heavy and already turning, but rich underneath with protein and fiber and toasted malt flavor, the very stuff a mill would dry and grind and sell, dumped free by people paying to be rid of it. Then the technician took over. 4/5 of the weight was only water. Dry it hard and fast enough to stop it souring, and one mound might hold hundreds of pounds of sound, shelf-stable meal, and there were 3, with more promised every week. She underlined a figure, went inside, and called Alder Creek Brewing, not to complain, to ask when the next load was coming, and to keep the soured old grain out of it. What she learned that first season she mostly learned the hard way, and the first lesson was that spent grain does not wait. Wet from the mash tun, it begins to sour and mold within a day, sometimes within hours in warm weather, so a load had to be spread and drying before the morning was out or the whole heap turned to a stinking waste, until her hands learned to move the grain the day it came, never the day after. The second lesson cost more. She dried a big batch of her best grain in too much heat to catch up on herself, and the meal scorched dark and bitter, acrid all the way through, a whole run ruined by her own hurry. She started again, low and slow, gentle warmth and moving air and patience, drawing the water off without ever cooking the grain. After that, she built the lab's discipline back into the work, a moisture check on every batch, and anything not dried below the line where mold takes hold went to the coarse heap, never into a customer's flour. A woman from the county had already walked her through the rest: the sales tax number, the cottage food and commercial kitchen license, and the health inspector's rules for drying and milling food for sale, and the pity in town had settled a little deeper. The man who could shorten her education by 2 years lived at the head of the next valley, his old machines rusting under a shed roof. Amos Kettner had milled grain for better than 30 years, running a little water-powered feed and flour mill for every farmer in 3 counties, until the trade dried up and the mill fell silent. He was 76 and deaf in one ear. Della drove out, laid it before him, and waited through a silence long enough to doubt herself twice. Then Amos walked her out back, pulled a tarp off a low-grain dryer and a cast-iron stone burr mill, showed her a hand press and a bank of sifting screens gone gray with dust, and sold her all of it for scrap, on the one condition that she never let it stand idle. Dry it the day it comes, or throw it out, he told her. Wet grain sours before it dries. Dry it low and slow, scorch it, and you have bitter meal, not flour. Sift the coarse husk off, or it will never bake light. And keep a moisture check on every batch, because damp meal molds a loaf, and a moldy loaf breaks a reputation. She wrote it all down. He watched her write and said only that most who came to him wanting to mill wanted it easy, and that she would do. Her first real commission nearly ended the whole thing. A calf down in the valley town hired her to bake dark loaves for its counter, and she wanted it so badly that she cut the corners a careful person never cuts. She leaned too hard on the spent grain flour, dried it fast and milled it coarse to keep up, and packed the order out warm. The loaves looked handsome going in. Then the truth of the flour came out. Spent grain, drained of its sugar and starch, has almost no gluten to lift a loaf and a great thirst for water, and her heavy loaves came out dense and gummy in the middle, and molded on the calf shelf within days, until the owner called her back. She let herself believe, for one evening, that everyone in town had been right about her. The next morning she began again from the grind. She dried the grain until it was bone dry and sweet, milled it fine, and worked it in as one part of a blend, never the whole, so the wheat did the lifting and the spent grain gave its color and its toasted nutty depth. It never gave trouble again. And she made herself a rule as hard as any in the lab. Nothing she dried or milled or baked left the place unless it was dry to the core and sound, no matter how far behind the order had fallen. The turn in the whole business came out of the part she had been treating as garbage. Drying and milling and sifting the grain left her with heaps of the coarse stuff. The husk and hull the screens threw out, too rough for a fine loaf, piling up in the back of the barn, worth nothing to any baker alive. She had half decided to compost the whole lot when a woman who boarded and bred dogs down the road asked, almost in passing, whether she had any of that spent grain to spare. Baked hard into a biscuit, the woman explained. It was rich and toasted and full of protein, and the dogs went wild for it. People paid handsomely for treats like that, and nobody local made them. Della baked her the first batch on the spot, astonished. Then a man who ran a pet shop in town asked for all the biscuit meal she could mill. Amos, come by about a belt on the dryer, picked up a handful of the coarse husk, pressed it in his fist, smelled it, and gave her the 2 words worth more than a week of flour. Mill that. She had been spending effort to be rid of the very thing 2 markets wanted. That season she began milling the coarse husk into biscuit meal on purpose and pressing the roughest, most scorched siftings into fire logs that burned long and sweet in a stove. The finishing touch, the thing that set her flour apart, came off her own written-off ground. The spent grain from the brewery was sound once she dried it, but it was commodity malt, the same barley every brewery in the state ran through its mash tun. The backfield her grandfather had left to itself, the stand of volunteer rye the appraiser had called a weed patch, carried something the brewery could not dump at any price, an old Landress rye sown generations back and left to seed itself down the years, dark and aromatic and full of a deep sour sweet flavor the milling world had long since bred out of its modern grain. She began cutting and threshing that old rye by hand each fall, stone milling it slow on Amos's burr mill, and blending its dark flour with her dried, spent grain into a loaf flour no commodity mill could match. The farm the whole county had written off was growing. Out of the weed field the county had written off twice over, the one ingredient all the clean malt in the valley could never give her. The second full season was the grind, and the grind did not photograph. It was a used flatbed dryer wagon bought at auction so she could spread a whole load at once without wrecking her back. It was the barn rewired and vented to Amos's plans, and the county's, a drying floor laid warm above the old mow, and sample loaves and jars of flour along the mill wall so a baker could feel the work before she bought it. It was milling on a Sunday with her hands moving over the meal the way they had once moved across a testing bench. Through all of it the trucks kept coming, and the town kept being gentle to her face. Then, one bright afternoon late in the second year, Amos Kettner stood at her bench and drew his thumb slowly through a fresh jar of her blended flour, feeling for the damp and the grit that spoil a loaf. He rubbed it, smelled it, wet a pinch of it on his tongue. That'll bake, he said, the highest praise the man owned, and she got no farther than the mill door before she had to sit down on a feed sack a minute. The market found her the way it finds anyone whose thing is real, a little at a time, then all at once by word of mouth. Saturdays she sold flour and crackers and jars of toasted granola off the farm to bakers and home cooks, and before long the dog biscuits the kennels could not keep in the bowl. One who stopped was a baker who ran a bread counter in the college town up the highway. She bought every sack of the blended flour Della had and called that Thursday for a standing order. Food people talk to food people. By the next spring, she was filling weekly orders for 2 bakeries and a natural food store that ran to 4 counties, moving dog biscuits by the case through a string of pet shops and kennels who could not keep them on the shelf, and pressing fire logs and baking crackers as fast as her hands would go. One dumped mound of spent grain was feeding 5 separate things now: flour and crackers, granola, dog biscuits, and fire logs, and behind them the dark blended loaf flour off her own heritage rye, not one of which could have existed without the leavings nobody else had wanted. By the fall of 2017, the 3rd autumn, the trucks from Alder Creek Brewing still turned up the gravel lane, but now they called first. The brewery had worked out that its spent grain was worth something to somebody, and had quietly begun to protect the arrangement, loads timed to her week, hauled cool, and tipped the same morning they were mashed, the soured lots screened out and the sweet mash kept in, and a spoken understanding that it came to the Rourke place first. 2 women from town worked alongside her through the busy months, glad of the wage. The barn wore a new steel roof, paid for outright. The bank had stopped calling about the taxes. Della Rourke never once said a number out loud, and this story is not going to say one for her. She was raised to believe you keep your money to yourself. But the accountant who closed her books that winter gave her the plain shape of it. The farm the county had written off had just turned in its best year in 2 generations, and it had not been close. Cars still slowed on the valley road. There was a neat mill sign at the end of the lane now, sacks of flour stacked square in the open barn, and on Saturday mornings a line of cars waiting to buy. People ask her at the mill door what the trick was, and she gives them the grain tester's answer. She looked closely at a thing everyone else had already written down as nothing. The brewery was not wrong that the grain was spent. It was spent to an operation built to draw the sugar out of malt and brew it into beer and clear the rest away as cheaply as it could. The brewery had asked the grain one question: how do we be rid of you? And never heard the only answer that mattered. She had walked out to the lot and asked it something else. What are you good for? And the whole business, the flour and the crackers and the dog biscuits and the dark rye off her own backfield, was nothing more than that one different question, asked patiently, 1 load at a time, for 3 years. Most opportunity does not arrive looking like opportunity. It arrives looking like a nuisance, a heap of spent grain steaming at your lot line, a mill rusting under a shed, a weed field, and a stretch of ground the whole county has agreed to stop believing in. It comes to you already labeled as waste because somebody bigger and busier decided it was not worth their while, which is the whole reason it is lying there for you to find. The grain was never garbage. It was only ever in the wrong hands, waiting on somebody who would ask what it was for instead of how to be rid of it. Somewhere near you right now there is almost certainly something written off: a field, a building, a skill, a person, waiting on somebody willing to look at it long enough to ask what nobody else bothered to. What is this actually good for? Sometimes the answer is nothing, and sometimes it is everything the people who dumped it could never see.